and I mentioned Left Horizons. And this evening, the gentleman who is going to give our talk for us today, another wonderful Northeasterner coming from Gateshead, he's the actual editor of Left Horizons. And Left Horizons can actually be found, there's a private group on Facebook. And tonight, John Pickard is going to be able to give us a talk about someone I'm not very sure about, someone I don't know a lot about, apart from the obvious, is a gentleman. I don't know if he could be called a gentleman. Anyway, it's a guy called Stalin. So John, welcome to For the Many Mondays, and I'm going to hand over to you now.
Right, good. Thank you very much. I hope you can all hear me, and perhaps more to the point, I hope you can all understand my accent. I have been told by my relatives in the Northeast that my accent has mellowed over the years since I've lived in the South. I'm a soft Southerner now, really, to be honest, living in Essex. I'll just say something about who I am. I've actually been in the Labour Party, apart from a brief period of expulsion, since 1965. And I've been an active socialist for all of that time. It's longer than I care to think about, really, but that's where I am. And today, as was said, I'm editor of Left Horizons, which aspires to be an online socialist newspaper. And we do carry a lot of very good articles, short ones and long ones, and I would recommend you to have a look at it. Now, coming to Stalin and Stalinism, really it's more important to talk about Stalinism than Stalin, because Stalinism represents an attitude, a method of political work, an approach to political work and political ideas, particularly on the left of the Labour movement. Whether it's really on the left is open to discussion, of course, but it's generally seen as part of the left. And of course, Stalinism takes its name from Stalin, from Joseph Stalin. And I think it's impossible really to discuss Stalinism without discussing Stalin, and vice versa. So I'll be dealing with both, what Stalinism represents and what Stalin represented. Now, the story begins really with the Russian October Revolution in 1917. And that revolution, 104 years ago, took place in one of the most backward countries of Europe. It was a country of great contradiction, because although the big majority of the country was rural, it was economically backward, it was illiterate, the vast majority of the population was illiterate. In the cities, and insofar as there was industry, it was the most modern industry. So in Petrograd, in Moscow, and in other big cities, there were industries which were of the most modern kind. So you could say that the working class, even though there were a tiny proportion of the population, were organized in some of the most advanced and some of the most up-to-date factories and workplaces. But they were like small islands, really, in a vast sea of backwardness. It's reasonable to say that across the whole piece, across the whole of the country, that Russia was an extremely backward country, and of all of the big countries in Europe, certainly the most backward. Now, the Bolsheviks understood this, and their perspective for revolution, when they launched the revolution, they didn't begin the revolution in February of 1917, but they gradually got more support during the months of 1917. I'm not going to give the full story of the Russian Revolution and the events, but by the time the Soviets took power in October of 1917, under the guidance of the Bolsheviks always had an internationalist outlook. They never imagined And you could check this by reading what was written by people like Lenin and Trotsky and so on. They never imagined that their revolution would be isolated in that backward country, in the most backward country of Europe. They always imagined that the workers of more up-to-date, more modern countries, more industrially advanced countries, particularly Germany and Central Europe, they believed that the workers of those countries would come to their assistance, and internationalism and worker solidarity would reach a hand across from east to west and west to east, and then that could begin the development of socialism internationally. That's what they believed. But unfortunately, that was not how it worked out. It's true that at the end of the First World War, there were waves of revolution right across Europe. That is true. And you had the overthrow, for instance, of the Kaiser in November 1918 in Germany. There was a revolution in Hungary. Soviets were established in Hungary. Soviets were established in Germany and in other places. But none of these led to a successful workers' revolution in the way that it had been in Russia in October of 1917. So the Russian Revolution, in the end, remained isolated. It remained isolated in a backward country. And what was worse was, as devastated as Russia was by October 1917, it became even more devastated over the course of the next few years. You have to remember, of course, by October 1917, Russia had been in the war for 3 years. It had lost millions of casualties. There was a huge amount of poverty, of starvation. In fact, the hardships of the First World War were one of the main factors that led to the revolution itself. But then after the revolution, it was a struggle for the government, for the Soviet government, to stay alive. Every major capitalist country sent armies against the Soviet government for obvious reasons. They didn't want to see a Soviet government succeed because it would set an example to their own workers in London, in Berlin, in Rome, and everywhere else. And all of the main capitalist countries sent armies against the Russian revolutions. There were British troops in the north of Russia, in Archangel and Murmansk. There were British troops also active on the border between what was then Persia and Russia. There were British troops active in Central Asia through Afghanistan, as it then was. American troops, Japanese troops in the east, in Siberia, French troops, Italian troops. Practically every single country sent armies against the Bolshevik Revolution. And not only that, but of course there were reactionary elements inside Russia itself who fought against the revolution, counter-revolutionaries. And so there was a long and protracted civil war, which went on right through until 1921. And eventually, by the organization of a Red Army, which eventually numbered, I think, something like 5 million troops, by the organization of a Red Army, in the most difficult circumstances, by the way, the Soviet government was able to survive. It was able to fight off the armies of intervention. It was able to defeat the counter-revolutionaries who sought to return to the old Tsarist regime. But those 3 years of civil war, coming on top of the First World War itself, were absolutely devastating as far as Russia was concerned. It left Russia in a really, it was really, as a country, it was really on its knees by 1921. Now, I'm going to just stop and come back to that in a moment, but just to say up to this point, Stalin himself, that's not his real name, of course. Stalin was his underground name when he was working as a Bolshevik underground. His real name was Jugashvili. He was born in Georgia. He adopted more than one underground name in his life as an underground revolutionary in the Tsarist regime. But up until that time, Stalin was largely an unknown person. He was a non-entity, really. He was a functionary. He often made political mistakes. He was largely unknown to the big majority of workers and members of the Bolshevik Party. Bolshevik Party, of course, in 1918 changed its name to the Communist Party, so it became the Communist Party. But Stalin was largely unknown in the Western press, in the media over here, but also within Russia itself. The leaders of the Russian Revolution were acknowledged to be Lenin and Trotsky. Trotsky was the leader of the revolution, particularly in Petrograd. He was the president of the Petrograd Soviet. Lenin was the great theoretician of the movement up until that point. And Lenin and Trotsky were the acknowledged leaders of the Russian Revolution. And Stalin was a non-entity. He'd found his way onto the Bolshevik Party Central Committee, I think in 1912, it was quite late on. But in the difficult period after the revolution itself, and that very, very difficult period, bear in mind the difficulties of the Civil War. Bear in mind that by 1921, there were millions starving. Millions were starving because agriculture had been completely disrupted. So the sowing of crops and, of course, the reaping of crops was completely disrupted. Industry was completely disrupted as well. And there was mass discontent. And by 1921, really, the Soviet government was fighting just to survive. It was no longer fighting the armies of intervention or the counter-revolutionaries, but it was still fighting to survive. Many of the best members of the Communist Party had sacrificed themselves, given their lives during the Civil War. And it was not always easy to find, even within the ranks of the Communist Party, it was not always easy to find people who were even literate, who were able to organize things, who were able to do things and manage things, who could read and write. So even people like Stalin, and Stalin was, as I say, a bit of a non-entity, a bit of a mediocrity. Even people like Stalin found important places for themselves in the party because there was no option, there was no alternative but to promote people like him. And as early as March of 1919, a year and a half after the October Revolution, Stalin found himself at the head of a special bureau set up by the party, which ironically was set up to try to counteract bureaucracy. It was set up to try, it was called the Workers' and Peasants' Inspectorate. It was set up to counteract bureaucracy. But as Trotsky said later on in his biography of Stalin, it turned the party's general secretariat into an inexhaustible fountainhead of favor and dispensation, because Stalin was able to appoint people into positions, to promote people into positions who supported him, who thereby owed him favors, who thereby owed him a good turn, and to establish within the party, even as early as 1919, to establish a network of people who were beholden to him for their position, for their favor, for the position that they had. And having a position was important because by 1921, with the economy completely devastated, with industry devastated, with agriculture devastated, it was necessary for the Communist Party to make an economic retreat. Whereas in the early days of the revolution, they had nationalized large parts of industry, large, even smallish industries, nationalized the railways, nationalized land. Whereas they did those things in the early days of the revolution. In 1921, they were forced to take some steps back. And they introduced a new economic policy, which was a measure of capitalist development, really, in agriculture, particularly in agriculture, so that the peasants would have an incentive to sow crops. Their crops wouldn't just be confiscated to feed the cities. The crops could be sold at a good price so they could make a profit. It was a concession to capitalism, the new economic policy. But it laid the foundations, it laid the economic framework, shall we say, for the rise of bureaucracy within the Communist Party itself, and also within the Soviets. You've got to imagine the situation where you have hardship, where you have shortages of homes, shortages of good food, shortages of clothing, shortages of all the necessities of life, and that was the situation in Russia, then anyone in a position of some power and influence will be, shall we say, at the very least tempted to make sure that they were all right personally, and their family was all right personally, and their friends were all right personally. And so it was the backwardness, it was the very backwardness, it was the very hardship, it was the difficulties that existed at that particular time, which reinforced the possibility of special privileges for those in the know. And those in the know, of course, increasingly with the membership of the Communist Party and the membership and the leadership of the Soviets, both at a local level, at a regional, and also at a national level. So really from 1921 onwards, given the fact that the Russian Revolution was isolated, it still hadn't spread any further than the boundaries of Russia itself, given the fact that Russia was extremely backward, you had the development of a bureaucracy which was only interested in itself, or shall we say it was particularly interested in itself. And that bureaucracy affected the party and it affected the Soviets themselves. What made the situation worse was that the best opportunity to spread the revolution to the rest of Europe was missed. There was a big revolutionary movement in Germany again in 1923, and the opportunity for that revolution was missed. And so the revolution was extremely isolated. So you had the rise of this bureaucracy within the party. And as I say, really for accidental reasons, Stalin was well placed from 1919 onwards. He was well placed to establish a network that suited him. And what made matters worse was then, after 1922, Lenin was incapacitated with a stroke. It looked like he was going to recover, but he didn't recover, and he died early in 1924. And even before his death, Lenin could see what was happening. Lenin understood what was happening, and he understood the mistake that had been made, appointing this mediocrity, this kind of guy with a bit of a sneaky attitude towards things. He wasn't that interested in politics. He was more interested in people and positions and influence. Lenin understood it was a mistake putting Stalin in the position he was in. And worse, by then, Stalin had become General Secretary of the Communist Party. And in Lenin's last testament, Lenin insisted that Stalin be removed, that Stalin was a danger. I can't remember the exact expression he said, something like, Stalin will only cook spicy dishes, implying that he causes trouble. Now, that last testament of Lenin was suppressed. It was suppressed, it wasn't published, it was suppressed by Stalin. Stalin was already strong enough to be able to do that. Later on, in 1956, when he became leader in the Soviet Union, Khrushchev actually published Lenin's last testament. It was many, many years later. This is running the tape on a little bit, of course, but it was many years later, after Stalin's death, that Khrushchev made a very, very famous speech at the 20th Communist Party Congress in 1956, where he denounced Stalin and everything that Stalin had represented. Be that as it may, rolling the clock back, this is where Russia was in 1924. Stalin was already strong enough to be able to understand that the interests of the bureaucracy were different to the interests of the mass of the population. And Stalin brought forward a new idea, completely alien to most members of the Communist Party, certainly to the old Bolsheviks. And this new idea was the idea of socialism in one country. This was the new theory that Stalin brought out after Lenin's death, socialism in one country. And it was completely contradictory to everything that the communists had fought for, believed in the past. But really, that was a political reflection of the fact that the bureaucracy was beginning to understand it had its own interests. And it didn't particularly need, it didn't particularly want to extend socialism across the rest towards Western Europe and the rest of Europe, because that would threaten the position of the bureaucracy itself. So that was the position. At the same time, of course, it was possible for Stalin to begin, from his position as General Secretary, to begin a political assault on those who would oppose him. Trotsky was opposed to Stalin, and Trotsky formed what became known as the left opposition. He opposed Stalin. He opposed the methods and the policies of the leadership. And Stalin began to develop a kind of a program, really, a campaign against Trotsky. Trotsky had been one of the two great leaders of the Russian Revolution. He was the founder and the organizer of the Red Army, which had won the Civil War. Trotsky's. So it took a long time, but a campaign was conducted against Trotsky and Trotskyism, a campaign of vilification, a campaign of lies. You can imagine, we've all experienced the campaign of lies and distortion that have been conducted against Jeremy Corbyn in the last few years. We've experienced this firsthand. But this was nothing really compared to the campaign against Trotsky and Trotskyism under Russian conditions, backed by the state through Pravda and Iskra and all of the various publications of the Russian state and the Communist Party, to such an extent that by 1928, just over 10 years after the revolution, Trotsky himself was expelled from the party. And then a year later, or something like 6 months later, he was actually sent into exile. He's actually pushed out into exile. I haven't got time really, and I don't think it's right to kind of go into all of the details of the twists and turns of the internal politics of the Soviet Union and the Communist Party under Stalin. The Communist Party zigged and zagged from left to right on a variety of occasions. To begin with, for instance, Stalin and the communist leadership supported the new economic policy. In Trotsky's view, they over-supported. They supported it too much. And that's why the left opposition was demanding a swing to the left towards industrialization and a clamp down on the rich capitalist peasantry that was developing in the countryside. But after it was only after Stalin had defeated Trotsky and expelled Trotsky from the party that he did actually move the party to the left, and then he began to turn a policy not of moving to the left, but a policy of ultra-leftism, a policy of industrialization, but not industrialization at a reasonable, measured pace, but a rapid industrialization, 5-year plans, completing a 5-year plan in 4 years, and things like this. And instead of collectivizing agriculture by example, by promoting modern agriculture, by persuasion, by using these methods. He moved towards forced collectivization, even against the wishes of the peasantry. So it was a swing not just to the left, but to the ultra left. And that also, again, in the late 20s and the very early part of the 1930s, resulted in a new period of hunger and starvation in the country, in that part of in Russia. And then at a later stage, in the mid-1930s, again, there was a swing back to the right. Now, all of these swings inside the Communist Party were carried out without discussion, without debate. The party apparatus under Stalin was really quite monolithic. There was no genuine debate. There was no genuine discussion. There was no free and open argument. And anyone who was against the party line was expelled from the party. At least they were expelled in the early days, in the 1920s. But by the 1930s, they weren't just expelled, they would find themselves in prison. They would find themselves in camps. And the policy, those kind of policies, those kind of methods, had a reflection in the communist parties around the world. Now, again, I haven't got time to deal with it, but because of the enormous authority and stature of the Russian Communist Party, through the Communist International, the Russian Communist Party had an enormous influence on the communist parties around the rest of Europe, not least, of course, the small British Communist Party. The Communist Party in Britain was never particularly big, but it was, all of these parties were influenced by the Russian Party simply because of its stature, because of the authority it had. It carried the authority of the October Revolution. It carried the authority of Lenin. And even if Trotsky's name by then had been dragged through the mud, it still had the authority of Lenin. So all of the twists and turns that took place in Russia also took place outside of Russia. And so you had, for instance, a political period where in Germany, when the Russian Communist Party was veering towards an ultra-left period. This was reflected in Germany, in the German Communist Party, also going to an ultra-left position, a mad ultra-left position. They said, for instance, this is in the late 1920s, they said, for instance, that the Social Democrats were just as bad as the Nazis. They called them social fascists. They're just as bad as the Nazis. And at one time, I think it was in Saxony in northern Germany, the German Communist Party supported the Nazis in a referendum campaign to try to get rid of the social democratic leader of the government of Saxony. And this mad policy, a sensible policy, of course, would have been for the Communist Party and the Social Democrats to unify, to fight together against the Nazis, because the Nazis posed a threat in Germany to the very existence of the labor movement. And a sensible policy would have been for the communist shop stewards, the communist trade unionists, the communist activists to work with the socialists to fight against and defend themselves against the Nazis. That should have been the policy. But the lunatic ultra-leftism of the Communist Party in Germany, in the end, was one of the main reasons why Hitler was able to come to power in 1933. And that was really a terrific indictment of the policy of Stalin and Stalinism up to that time. I'll come in a moment to what Trotsky's view was of Stalinist Russia. But of course, Stalin was also faced with a situation where he had to consolidate himself, to firmly establish himself. He had to effectively rewrite the whole of history. It's interesting. I don't know if comrades here have read George Orwell's books. I dare say you all have. But books like 1984 were really written on the basis of George Orwell's understanding of what Russia was like in the 1930s, where you had things like truth speak, where when you said one thing, you meant something completely different. And of course, that was fashioned on the style of Stalinist Russia. And no one in history, probably, right up until the present time, no one in history has done such an effective and efficient and an all-encompassing job on rewriting history, refashioning history to suit their own position and their own standing. The whole of Bolshevik history was rewritten. And the remaining leaders of the old Bolshevik party were all tried. It was discovered that Trotsky was in exile. He was the only one who was safe. That was the irony. But it was discovered by Stalin that Trotskyism was actually the same as fascism. And anyone who had anything to do with Trotskyism and was straight off to the camps or worse, were shot. Other leaders who had been leaders, people who had been leaders of the Bolshevik Revolution 19 years earlier, were tried in show trials, and they were shot. People like Zinoviev and Kamenev and Bukharin, and all of the old leaders of the Bolshevik party were killed. I mean, you can actually see a poster. I haven't got it here. I could have possibly put it up on a share screen, but I haven't got it handy. But you can actually see a poster of all of the old Bolshevik leaders from 1917. And there's about 20, 25 of them. And by 1936, 37, all of them had been killed. Well, a few, that's not true. A few of them died naturally, like Lenin himself. A few had disappeared. Well, the majority of them had been killed by Stalin. The only two people left alive were Stalin and Trotsky, because he was in exile. And no one in history, before or since, has done such a job on rewriting history as Stalin was able to do, even to the point of doctoring photographs so that Trotsky's image was taken out and Stalin's image was put in, for example. All kinds of things like this. No one in history has done that. But those kind of ideas and those kind of political methods also infiltrated out to all of the other communist parties around the world. Later on, you had the Daily Worker, which was the newspaper of the British Communist Party. It's changed its name more recently to the Morning Star, but it used to be called the Daily Worker. The Daily Worker would say things like, well, you've got to treat any Trotskyists you meet, you've got to treat them in the same way you would treat fascists. That's what they actually said. Now, one of the best analyses of the betrayal of the Russian Revolution and the development of bureaucracy, one of the best analyses, without a doubt, a book called Revolution Betrayed by Trotsky. Incidentally, one of the best biographies of Stalin was also written by Trotsky, and he was still writing it when he was assassinated in 1940. But going back to 1936, Trotsky wrote The Revolution Betrayed. And what Trotsky said was, he said, if you look at the political apparatus of Nazi Germany, Hitler was well established by then, of course. If you look at the political apparatus of Nazi Germany and Stalinist Russia, they're identical. The same secret police, the same networks of political police and informers, the same concentration camps, the same murders without trial, the extrajudicial murders, you know, the same fear stalks the whole of society, the same inability to speak your mind, to openly to speak and have an opinion and express an opinion. So the political apparatus of Nazi Germany and Stalinist Russia were identical. But there was one important difference that Trotsky said existed, one very, very important difference. If you look underneath the political apparatus, at the economic foundation of the state, they were completely different. In Nazi Germany, the state was still largely in private hands. Private owners of banks, industry, transportation, and so on. They were knocked about a bit, but it was still privately owned, private ownership of arms manufacturers and so on. It was a capitalist economy, in other words, a market-driven economy with some distortions that the Nazis themselves introduced, but it was largely capitalist economy. But in Russia, it was different. Underneath the superstructure of this awful, horrible, undemocratic, totalitarian structure, underneath that structure, there was a state-owned economy and state planning and state management. It's true it was done in a very bureaucratic way. And it's also true that the bureaucracy would cream off for itself a significant part of the wealth for itself to make sure they got the best homes, the best food, the best clothing, and so on. But nevertheless, it was a planned, organized, state-owned economy. It was, if you like, a socialist economy, a socialist foundation upon which this monstrous superstructure had existed. That was important later on, by the way, because during the Second World War, once Russia entered the war, there was never any point in the war when less than 75% of the Nazi war machine was directed towards the east. There was never any point when it was less than 75%. And why did Russia survive? And why was Russia able to turn the tide in 1942 and push the Nazis back? It was because of the fact that the economy was planned and it was possible to organize and manage the economy. We had an article on the website a couple of weeks ago about this, actually, because it was the anniversary. The fact is that to save themselves, the Russians were able to literally dismantle and reassemble hundreds of miles to the east, entire factories, take entire workforces with their families to the east, away from the front. And they could only do that because of the fact that it was a planned, organized economy. Now, I've gone on a little bit longer than I'd planned to do, but you could see that in the rise of Stalinism, you could see certain political methods were evident here. The absence of discussion, the possibility of quick switches from left to right, and so on. I mean, there's a story, for instance, in Britain about a Communist Party speaker at Speaker's Corner. Now, this might be apocryphal, I don't know, but I have heard this story about a Communist Party speaker at Speaker's Corner, denouncing the Nazis and saying what awful people the Nazis were. This is in 1940 or 1941, or denouncing the Nazis and demanding that a second front be opened against the Germans. And this guy was tugged, his friend tugged his coat, and I said, I want to whisper in your ear, whisper in his ear. And he whispered in his ear, the Nazis have just signed a non-aggression pact with Hitler, with Stalin, the non-aggression pact between, and of course that completely switched things around. So this speaker stood up, continued his speech, and then denounced the capitalist countries for trying to drag Britain into war. So they kind of did a complete switch, almost in mid-sentence. You can see where George Orwell gets his ideas from. I don't know if that's apocryphal or not, but clearly that switch, without any explanation, without any discussion in the communist parties, without any kind of reasonable expectation that it should be justified in some way, that switch was typical of what the Communist Party would do. And of course, after the Hitler-Stalin pact, the whole situation turned tables once again, when the Nazis invaded Russia later on. So that's what that's where Stalinism exists. That's where Stalinism comes from, basically from the isolation of what was a well-meaning and a well-intended revolution, the isolation of that revolution in the most backward country of Europe, and the development on top of that of a bureaucracy which had its own interests, its own privileges, its own special perks and so on. And that bureaucracy established and consolidated itself by the suppression of any opposition and the suppression of any democracy and discussion. Now, Stalinism today, I'm going to finish soon because I don't want to talk too long. Stalinism today it still exists. The Communist Party in Britain has never been particularly big, but it still has some supporters even now. It still has some people inside, particularly inside the trade union movement, a few here and there inside the Labour Party. And I would suggest that Stalinism today still exists as a kind of a pseudo-left ideology. And it's given to bureaucratic maneuvers rather than democratic debate and discussion. You still get it inside the trade union field, where old guys, it's usually guys as well, unfortunately, old guys or old Communist Party members will use their branch to make a nomination or to send an affiliation or something like this, their trade union branch, without discussing with the members, without justifying it with the members, without taking it to the members and getting their discussion on it. Bureaucracy, the Stalinism exists today as a tendency to dilute socialist ideas, a tendency to develop a perspective and a program which is not based upon the needs of the working class, but somehow cobbles together a kind of a coalition of different classes and different ideas and so on. And it's an ideology today that clings to the stages theories, the stages theory of social change. You can't have socialism until you've got this. You can't have a socialist change until you've got you've got to go through these kind of stages all of the time. And these features that arose in the old communist parties, I think, still persist in the small communist parties and in Communist Party fellow travellers today. I hope I haven't bored you all to tears. There's so much I've actually left out because I'm conscious of the time, and I don't think in a Zoom meeting it's best to talk for too long. So perhaps we could take some questions and discussion, and I can respond to them in the course of the discussion.
Well, I'd like to thank you, John. It wasn't boring at all. I got a lot of information from you, which I did not realise, and I understand the Soviet Union a little bit better than I did before. But as you said, you want to open this out, and so what I'd like people to do is, if you want to ask a question or to make a point about what you've heard this evening, if you can use your hand up on the actual participants thingy-me-bob, then I will take the first hand that rises. And nobody's got their hand up at the moment. No one's got their hand up at the moment. This is, come on, guys. I'm going to have to ask a question if nobody wants to ask a question. You mentioned, John, about the secret police. And you mentioned, you never mentioned Bearer. Is it Bearer?
Beria.
How influential was he within Stalin's regime?
I would say he was extremely influential. We talked earlier on about the film The Death of Stalin, and it's a marvelous film, very, very good film, but a lot of it is true to life. Beria wasn't the first head of the secret police, of course. There were two others, and both of them were also killed by the Stalinist regime. I always get them mixed up which one came first. One called Yagoda and one called Yetsov, and one bumped the other off, And then eventually Beria bumped the other guy off. So Beria was around for quite some time. I think he came to the head of the secret police in the late 1930s, 1938, 39, something like that. But it is true, as the film shows, that Beria would have had files on everybody. He would have had files on everybody. And the film makes that quite clear. And of course, it's not surprising that when Stalin himself died, I don't actually know how Beria was killed, but the film, although it's a kind of a black comedy, presents a picture where they all gang up and kill Beria because he's a threat to all of them. And that's quite plausible, to be honest. He was actually killed in the process of working out the succession to Stalin. He was actually killed at that time. And whether he was dragged into the courtyard by General, what's his name, General Zhukov or not, I don't know. But certainly they would have feared him. And it's a little bit like, in an earlier period, before Beria was the leader, when it was Yatsov and Yagida, by the time the regime had established itself, it was a little bit like being in Nazi Germany. I don't know if you've read any books about what it was like in Nazi Germany, where every street had its gossip, not its gossip. Every street had its informer, and it was usually the worst type. The Torag that nobody liked. That was the street informer. And in a big block of flats, every block of flats would have its informer. And you had to be careful what you were doing because curtains would twitch. You had to be careful who you're talking to and who you're seeing because people might find out. And there was that fear there all of the time. And there were files and there were kind of detailed records kept on people, and they were used. Not only in the short trials in 1936-37, they were used against anybody who had any connections with Trotsky. Trotsky's own children, by the way, were killed. Anybody who had connections with connections were killed. And there were massive purges of tens of thousands of people. And these purges continued. Came in waves. One of the biggest purges, ironically, happened just before the Nazis invaded. And guess who was purged? It was the top layer of the military. So the tops of the army, the Air Force, and the Navy were purged for being Trotskyists. They were killed. Some of them weren't killed, fortunately, because they were able to bring them out of prison to help fight the war. And that was one of the reasons, it's not the only reason, but it's one of the reasons why the Nazis in 1941 were able to invade Russia and go for hundreds of miles with very little opposition because the army was completely disorganized thanks to Stalin's purge. I'm getting off the point a little bit, but yes, in answer to the question, yes, they would have feared Beria. The only one who wouldn't have feared Beria would have been Stalin himself, but everybody else would have been afraid of him.
Right, we got a question here from Andy, and then I'll go to either Phil or Alex. Andy?
Okay. Hi, John. Thanks very much for that. That was really excellent, clear, concise, brief but concise history of that period. And I'm just wondering, as a socialist, I was always when you were arguing with people, you'd always have to defend the Soviet Union. You didn't want to because you knew what it was like, or I didn't know what it was like in the way that you've kind of explained, but you still had to defend it. And that was used as an argument to say, well, we don't want that here. And I'm just wondering, in your own experiences, how you found that after the Berlin Wall went down? Because after that went down, I found, notwithstanding, I quite agree with everything you've said, I was a bit depressed when that went down because that allowed capitalism a full reign. There was nothing to stop it apart from there was Cuba. But Russia was the main kind of bogeyman, and that had gone. And so but at the same time, I think it might have allowed us to argue for socialism without having to defend the indefensible of the Soviet Union. So That's one question. And another one, which is a huge topic, John, but I'd just like you to touch on it, is just the role of the Communist Party in the Spanish Civil War, because that was another atrocity, really, by the Communist Party, as my understanding is of it. And if you could kind of give some books that people could read on that would give a good account from a political perspective of what took place in Spain during that period.
Thanks, Andy. John?
Yeah, as regards the Soviet Union, before 1989, before the Berlin Wall came down, we were in a position as socialists where I would have argued, I would have said, the only thing that remains of the October Revolution is the state-owned planned economy, even though it's planned in a very bureaucratic and a very wasteful way, with all kinds of mismanagement, all kinds of special perks and privileges for the bureaucrats. That's the only thing that remains. But you're absolutely right, Andy. After 1989, after there was a period of turbulence, and then a period when Yeltsin took power. After that period, there was a restoration of capitalism. It's a special kind of capitalism, really, because many of the top bureaucrats were able to create a capitalist market simply by giving away or finding some kind of device, some kind of semi-legal device to sell off steelworks, aluminium works, to sell off transport, gas production plants, oil wells, and all of that's how, you know, that's how this guy bought Chelsea Football Club. You go back in history and you find some of his deals were very, very, very dubious. And all of these, what they call oligarchs, started off by effectively appropriating, semi-legally or illegally appropriating what had been state-owned sections of the economy. So you're dead right there. It has become effectively a capitalist state, a special kind, more of a mafia state. As to the Communist Party in Spain, you are right, because whereas in the 1930s, the Communist Party may have made mistakes, the Berlin and the German Revolution in 1923 failed. It was political errors. The Chinese Revolution in 1927-29, again, it failed, political errors. But by 1936, when the Spanish Revolution began, the Stalinists in Moscow were consciously trying to hold that movement back. That was one reason why they had the purges, because the two things went together. They were trying to consolidate their position at home and consolidate their position by preventing revolution abroad. And one of the best books to read is George Orwell's book, Homage to Catalonia. George Orwell, of course, was in the militia of the POUM, which had some kind of a loose association with the ILP in Britain. And he was wounded in the while he was over there. But he describes in Catalonia and Barcelona, he describes the role of the Communist Party, and it's been done by one of Mike Lynch's films as well. Another very, very good book to read it's called simply Revolution and Counter-Revolution in Spain by a guy called Felix Morrow. I would recommend reading that. But the Communist Party in Spain played a counter-revolutionary role, without a shadow of doubt. They were part of the Republican government, but every single thing they did weakened the Republican government militarily and weakened it politically. Every single step they took. And that's why Franco was able to win the war. As long as the revolution was a revolution, a political movement, then Franco was pushed back. But as soon as that movement stopped being a revolution and became just a republic, a capitalist republic, which was supported by the Communist Party, as soon as that started to happen, then Franco was winning and the republic was pushed back. And that's what happened in Spain. So yeah, George Orwell's book, Homage to Catalonia, is one of the best, still is.
Thanks, John. Got another question for you now. It's either from Phil or it's from Alex.
Yeah, it's me.
It's you, Phil.
And the previous question has probably covered a bit of it, because we're going to talk about Orwell and homage to Catalonia. But I mean, Stalin was clearly involved in Spain in 1936, whatever. And at the same time, over here, we had a Tory government who was wanting appeasement with Hitler, whatever. And I mean, was Stalin then sort of in the vanguard of opposing Hitler, where we weren't and nobody else was, and obviously Russia took a hell of a lot of the war effort against Hitler, you know, and had a hell of a lot more deaths than we had. I'm just thinking about Stalin's role against Germany, sort of from about 1935, 36 onwards, and whereas everybody else didn't really seem to be taking the threat as all that great. Certainly the Tories didn't.
John.
I haven't got time to go into all the details of what I would describe as the Spanish Revolution and the failures of that. Felix Morrow's book, as well as George Orwell, Felix Morrow's book, Revolution and Counter-Revolution in Spain. Definitely recommend you to read that. But the role of the Communist Party was to hold back the revolution in Spain and to find allies where there weren't really allies. They set up shadows. They set up, if you like, they didn't. It was part of their policy of the stages theory of socialism. You can't have the social revolution until you complete the bourgeois revolution or the capitalist revolution. You've got to have a strong capitalist state before you can have a socialist state. And the policy of the Communist Party in Spain was to establish a capitalist state that was the republic for them, and that capitalist state would then fight against Franco. But it was a nonsensical policy, because all of the Spanish capitalists supported Franco. All of the top generals supported Franco. All the tops of the church and the civil service supported Franco. And the idea that you could set up a stable capitalist government to fight against Franco was a nonsense. And of course, Franco was supported militarily by Italy and by Germany. You know, the German Air Force bombed Guernica, of course, you know, which was the subject of Picasso's famous mural, and the Italian government sent arms as well. The Russian government did sell some arms to the Republic. They didn't donate them, they sold them. But basically their policy was a nonsense. They were trying to create an alliance with ghosts, with the capitalist class, and with a kind of a state bureaucracy, and with a liberal elite that didn't exist. At least insofar as it did exist, they supported Franco. And very many of the generals they thought they had on their side in the Republic actually defected to Franco. And on many parts of the front and many parts of the war front, Franco made advances precisely because of the betrayals of Republican officers and Republican generals. So, you know, the whole policy was wrong. As long as Spain was in a revolution, as long as it was fighting in the interest of workers and the interest of Spanish peasants, as long as it was doing that and it had that revolutionary fervor, it could win, and it did win in the early days. But as long as that was suppressed and they tried this pretense that they were a kind of a normal capitalist government, as long as they offered that pretense, then they were doomed to fail. And that's exactly what happened.
Thank you, John. Nobody else has put their hands up. So unless I get a hand up in the next 5 seconds, I'm going to call it a day. And I'm going to thank you a great deal, John, for everything this evening. I know that you wanted to get away for about 10 past or 9:15. It's now 7 minutes past 9. I hope that would help. Unfortunately, you got 3 minutes to go because Adam has just put his hand up. Would like to ask a quick question, I hope. Would you be prepared to take it, John?
Yeah, that's
cool.
fine.
Adam.
All right, I was just applauding, but I will ask. I will ask the question anyway. How do you think is it primarily because of Stalin that the media and certainly the right have been able to associate, well, let's say the failure of because of what Stalin did with communism and anything reasonably remotely left? I think it's amazing how successful they've been in saying, look, it didn't that happened, therefore the whole thing is you know, it's amazing how they've been able to spin that for all these years. And I just wonder, is that primarily because of, or just a better way of connecting through the media and through the...
Yeah, I think that's it. Before I answer Adam's question, by the way, I've put on the chat, I've put a link to the website that I edit, and I would recommend you all have a look at it if you get the chance. It's a very, very good question, Adam, without a shadow of doubt. All through the history of the workers' movement, of the labour movement, names and labels have been distorted or twisted or shit on, if you excuse my French, from time to time. It was, you know, it was very interesting that even 170 years ago, when Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels wrote the Communist Manifesto, they called it the Communist Manifesto because they didn't want to be associated with a certain brand of socialists. And history keeps turning these circles. And certainly in my younger days, it's not so important now, but certainly in my younger days, as you've said, Adam, I was very, very careful to say, well, if someone said to me, "Are you a communist?" I was always very, very careful to say, well, depends what you mean by communist. I'm a Marxist, all right, I'm a socialist, but if you think I'm anything like Russia, I don't agree with that, because Russia is not a communist state. It's not a socialist state. The only remaining element of the Russian Revolution, this is up to 1989, the only remaining element was the state plan, the state organized economy and the planned economy. I mean, that was good. You know, there's no two ways about that. Russia developed economically, industrially, albeit with all kinds of costs that they should not have had to pay, but they developed enormously to become a superpower, in the same way that the Chinese have done that, by the way. But yes, you're right. I was always, and I'm still very, very careful to pick and choose the labels I use very, 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 very carefully, because that word communist did, in the end, because of Stalinism, because of the bureaucracy, because of the short trials, because of this easy facility to switch tack one way and pretend, you know, support this view and then support that view, say, well, I never supported that view, you know, and then go back again, say, no, I never supported that view. That's where George Orwell gets his ideas. In 1984, he describes these kind of flip-flops all the time. And because of that reputation, then communism did have a bad name. It did have a bad name. Or at least to a degree. There were some. I'm not suggesting that ordinary rank and file communists were bad people. Far from it. A lot of them were genuine people who believed they were fighting for the working class. But certainly it had a bad name. It had a bad ring to it, and that's why it's important. By the way, the same applies to Trotskyists. I think Trotsky was a marvelous socialist, a hero to me, and he was eventually assassinated in 1940 by one of the agents of Stalin. There's the irony. He hadn't quite finished writing a biography of Stalin, and one of Stalin's agents assassinated him. But you know, even then, though I think Trotsky was a great socialist in his day, I would hesitate to describe himself as a Trotskyist, because there's so many other people around who do describe themselves as Trotskyists, and I think, well, I'm not really like them. I don't really have the same attitudes and the same outlook as them. So I'd have to be very, very careful. So yes, you're absolutely dead right. That was a word that was sullied, it was dirty, that was dragged through the mud, and that was all down ultimately to Stalin himself and the regime that he established in Russia, particularly in the 30s.
Wow, thank you very, very much for that, John. Absolutely super.